The wind does not howl across the Russian steppe. It whispers. It carries the scent of turned earth, shattered pine, and the faint, metallic tang of blood long frozen. Listen closely to the silence that blankets the fields west of Moscow, a place known to history only as the Rzhev Salient. Beneath the untouched pristine snow of winter, beneath the quiet birch forests that stand like pale ghosts in the twilight, lies a graveyard so vast it swallows the horizon. But the dead here do not rest in peace. They were not merely killed by the enemy, they were spent. They were currency in a transaction so cold, so mathematically ruthless, that it was erased from the archives, scrubbed from the memoirs of marshals, and buried under the heavy, suffocating weight of Soviet myth. This is not a story of a battle. It is the anatomy of a betrayal orchestrated not by traitors, but by the very architect of the nation's survival. In the late autumn of 1942, the world's eyes were fixed upon the burning ruins of Stalingrad. The city on the Volga was a cauldron of fire and steel, a meat grinder where the life expectancy of a Soviet infantryman was measured in hours. It was the absolute focal point of the war, the place where the ideological hatred of two empires collided in a landscape of pulverized brick and shattered bone. The world watched Stalingrad holding its breath, and Joseph Stalin knew this. In the cavernous, dimly lit offices of the Kremlin, far from the screams and the suffocating dust, the Soviet dictator stood before a massive mapboard. He did not look at Stalingrad. His pipe smoke drifted upward, curling around the red pins that marked the front lines, his eyes fixed on a bulge in the line, barely 200 kilometers from Moscow. Rzhev. The dagger pointed at the heart of the Soviet Union. For the men shivering in the waterlogged trenches of the Rzhev Salient, the war was an intimate, filthy apocalypse. They were the forgotten sons of the motherland, huddled in dugouts carved from the unforgiving permafrost. They wrapped their frozen feet in rags, clutched their Mosin-Nagin rifles with numb-cracking fingers, and stared out into the endless, terrifying expanse of no man's. Across the craters, the German Ninth Army waited, entrenched in a fortress of concrete, steel, and interlocking fields of fire. The Soviet soldiers here believed, with every ounce of their weary souls, that they were the vanguard. They were told that the time for retreat was over. They were told that they were the spearhead of a magnificent, overwhelming offensive that would shatter the German lines, crush Army Group Center, and push the fascist invaders back to Berlin. They were given extra rations, fresh ammunition, and the fiery speeches of political commissars who spoke of glory and eternal remembrance. They did not know that they were already ghosts. Deep within the Soviet High Command, a plan of staggering, terrifying duality had been born. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the blunt, ruthless savior of Moscow, had devised two massive winter camps. Operation Uranus was designed to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, but Uranus required absolute secrecy and overwhelming force. It required the Germans to look away, and so, Operation Mars was conceived. Mars was the offensive at Rzhev. It was massive, involving over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and an unimaginable concentration of artillery. But Mars was not designed to succeed. It was designed to bleed. It was a decoy, a gargantuan, mechanized sacrifice offered upon the altar of strategic deception. The secret was not merely that Mars was a secondary attack. The terrifying truth, hidden behind the thick oak doors of the Kremlin, was that Soviet intelligence deliberately leaked the details of Operation Mars to the German High Command through a network of double agents orchestrated by the NKVD. The precise dates, the troop concentrations, the exact points of attack were whispered into the ears of German generals. Stalin and Zhukov intentionally handed the blueprint of their own offensive to the enemy. They needed the Germans to be absolutely certain that the main Soviet blow would fall at Rzhev, not Stalingrad. They needed the Germans to rush their panzer reserves to the north, leaving the southern flanks of the Volga weak, stretched, and vulnerable. And to make the deception believable, the attack at Rzhev had to be real. It had to be massive. It had to be a slaughter. When the artillery barrage began in the pre-dawn darkness of November 25, 1942, the earth itself seemed to fracture. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire in unison, a rolling thunder that turned the eastern sky into a solid wall of bruised purple and violent orange. The concussion waves shattered the winter ice, tearing the birch trees from their roots. For an hour, the Soviet infantry waited in their trenches, the ground shuddering beneath their boots, a strange, grim hope rising in their chests. Surely nothing could survive that bombardment. Surely the path was clear. When the whistles blew, a sound thin and reedy against the roaring silence that followed the guns, they rose. A massive, undulating wave of brown greatcoats, bayonets glinting in the pale morning light, surging across the frozen mud. They screamed "Ura," a collective roar of defiance and release, charging toward the German lines. They did not know the Germans were waiting. Behind the shattered remnants of the first defensive line, the German machine gunners of the Ninth Army had survived the barrage deep in reinforced bunkers. They had known the attack was coming. They knew exactly where the Soviet columns would emerge. As the first wave of Soviet infantry entered the killing zones, the German MG-42s, the weapons they called Hitler's buzzsaws, opened fire. It was not a battle. It was an industrial harvest of human life. The trace of fire cut through the gloom like scythes of solid light. The Soviet lines did not break. They simply disintegrated. Men were torn apart, their bodies folding into the snow, their blood instantly steaming in the freezing air. The sound of the machine guns was a continuous tearing canvas, drowning out the screams of the wounded. Yet, the Soviet commanders, following their orders from Moscow, sent in the next wave, and the next, and the next, battalion after battalion, brigade after brigade, fed into the meticulously prepared German crossfire. The snow of the Rzhev Salient turned into a grotesque mosaic of red and gray. The Soviet tanks, The heavy KV-1 South and nimble T-34s, intended to exploit the breakthrough, became bogged down in the swampy cratered terrain, sitting ducks for the waiting German anti-tank guns. They burned like funeral pyres across the steppe, the smell of roasted flesh and incinerated diesel mixing with the falling snow. For the soldiers on the ground, the reality of the slaughter defied comprehension. A young conscript from the Urals, thrust into the vanguard, watched as his entire company was erased in a span of 3 minutes. He lay in the freezing mud behind the bloated corpse of a horse, gripping his rifle, unable to move, unable to breathe. He watched as his comrades, boys he had shared bread and tobacco with the night before, were reduced to torn meat and ragged cloth. There was no glory here. There was only the mechanical, deafening roar of death. He looked back toward the Soviet lines, waiting for the order to retreat, waiting for the flares that would signal an end to the madness. But the only orders that came were to advance, not a step back. The commissars in the rear with their submachine guns ensured the momentum was strictly forward. The men were caught between the immovable anvil of the German defenses and the unrelenting hammer of their own high command. They fought with a desperate localized heroism that the history books would never properly record. Small groups of Soviet infantry, crawling through the gore of their fallen comrades, managed to breach isolated German trenches. The fighting devolved into primitive, savage brawls. Men tore at each other with sharpened trench spades, bayonets, and bare hands in the claustrophobic darkness of the dugouts. They died choking on the freezing mud, their fingers gouging the eyes of their enemies, locked in a gruesome embrace of mutual destruction. But these localized breaches were meaningless. The German reserves, the very reserves Stalin had lured to Rzhev, arrived in force. Panzer divisions swept down upon the exhausted, bleeding Soviet penetrations, closing the trap, crushing the isolated pockets of resistance under the treads of their tanks. Day after day, the meat grinder churned. The landscape became unrecognizable, a lunar wasteland of overlapping craters, shattered wood, and unburied dead. The temperature plummeted, freezing the corpses into rigid, grotesque statues. The German machine gunners, protected in their bunkers, began to suffer from psychological collapse. They were firing until their barrels melted, until their shoulders bruised, until they were physically sickened by the sheer volume of slaughter they were inflicting. They watched in horror and disbelief as the Soviet infantry continued to march into the fire. Wave upon suicidal wave, an endless tide of flesh crashing against a wall of steel. They wrote in their diaries of the Ivan who seemed to have no regard for life, not realizing that the Ivan was trapped in a strategic nightmare, a pawn in a game he could not perceive. Far to the south, the trap sprang shut. Operation Uranus was launched. The Soviet armies sliced through the weak Romanian and Italian flanks, moving with a speed and precision that stunned the world. Within days, the German 6th Army was surrounded at Stalingrad. The tide of the Second World War had definitively turned. Victory was hailed as a masterpiece of Soviet military genius. In the Kremlin, Stalin received the news with a slow, measured nod. The map board had been realigned. The southern front was secure. But at Rzhev, the bleeding continued. Operation Mars raged on for weeks after Uranus had succeeded. Even though the strategic objective of tying down the German reserves had been achieved, the orders from Moscow did not change. The offensive had to maintain the illusion of being the main effort. The Soviet commanders on the ground, men like Ivan Konev, begged for permission to halt the attacks, citing catastrophic losses and the impossibility of a breakthrough. Their pleas were met with cold silence from the Stavka. The men in the mud were required to keep dying so that the victory in the south would not be compromised. They were expected to pay the ultimate price for a lie. It is estimated that over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the Rzhev Meat Grinder during Operation Mars. It was a casualty rate that rivaled, and in some sectors exceeded, the horror of Stalingrad. But there would be no medals for the defense of Rzhev. There would be no sweeping cinematic epics, no grand monuments raised in the immediate aftermath. When the Germans finally evacuated the salient months later, conducting a masterfully organized tactical withdrawal, the Soviet forces simply moved into a graveyard. The silence that fell over Rzhev in the spring of 1943 was heavier than the artillery barrages that preceded it. As the snow melted, the earth gave up its dead. Tens of thousands of bodies emerged from the freezing mud, perfectly preserved in their final moments of agony. The forests were silent. Even the birds had fled the stench of decay. The young conscript from the Urals, if he had survived, would have looked upon the desolate wasteland and wondered what it was all for. He would never know that his suffering, the death of his friends, the destruction of his youth, was merely a line item in a ledger of deception. He would never know that the supreme commander of his nation had looked at a map, weighed the souls of 1,000,000 men, and decided they were acceptable losses in a shadow play of power. This is the ultimate tragedy of war. Stripped of its romantic veneer, it is the realization that courage, sacrifice, and the enduring human spirit can be weaponized, manipulated, and discarded by those who operate in the cold, detached spheres of grand strategy. The men who died at Rzhev were not defeated by the enemy's tactical superiority. They were consumed by their own leaders' terrifying calculus. They were the ghosts who bought the victory at Stalingrad with their own unacknowledged blood. Look now upon the quiet fields of Rzhev. The scars on the earth have healed, covered by tall grass and the slow, forgiving march of time. But the soil is still rich with the iron of spent ammunition and the calcium of shattered bones. The wind that whispers through the birch trees carries no anthems, no speeches of political triumph. It carries only the profound, melancholic weight of an unforgivable truth. It is the sound of an army that marched into the abyss, believing they were the light. never knowing they were only the shadow cast to hide the sun. And as the twilight deepens over the Russian steppe, the silence remains absolute and eternal, a monument to the forgotten and an indictment of the power that betrayed them.